And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode explores Plato's story of Atlantis, one of the most enduring and enigmatic myths in Western thought. His tale is examined with depth, nuance, and philosophical relevance. Rather than a simplistic retelling or a search for historical truth, this episode takes a measured and engaging exploration of Atlantis, tracing its role in Plato's political philosophy, from the ideal republic to the dangers of unchecked power, and its profound influence on how we understand civilization today. We also consider the interpretations and misinterpretations of Atlantis over the centuries, from Renaissance utopianism to modern-day conspiracy theories. Whether you are a seasoned scholar of ancient philosophy or a curious listener encountering Plato's Atlantis for the first time, this episode provides a thought-provoking look at the philosophical questions of power, myth, and the fate of empires that continue to shape our world. For further reading and ways to support us, go to the Deeper Thinking podcast, podbean.com. Let's dive in. A city of gold, a fleet unmatched, a kingdom swallowed in a single night. This is Atlantis, or so the story goes. Plato did not claim to have seen it, nor did he present it as a history recorded in stone. He spoke of Atlantis as something passed down, a whisper through the ages, a tale of power and punishment. It was the Egyptian priests, he tells us, who first told the story to Solon, who then carried it to Athens, where it drifted through generations before landing in the words of Critias. And yet, it is Critias, an oligarch, a manipulator, a figure of shadows, who speaks it into existence. Already we are caught between what is real and what is a lie. Atlantis was not just a city. It was an empire, a force upon the world, stretching its power across the seas, its influence woven into every shore it touched. It was an island vast and rich beyond imagining. Its kings descended from Poseidon himself, its laws firm, its people industrious, its warriors unmatched. And yet its fall was certain, as if written into the very stone of its temples. 9,000 years before Athens, Critias says, Atlantis flourished, but it did not remain as it was. It grew, and with growth came hunger, and with hunger came the reach for more. No longer satisfied with its own wealth, its own beauty, its own security, Atlantis turned its gaze outward. It moved to conquer, to take, to rule. It became what it was never meant to be. Plato does not give us the end of the story. He does not tell us how Atlantis fell, only that it did. We are left with an image, a world swallowed by the sea, an empire lost in a moment. Was it divine punishment, a natural disaster, a metaphor for the corruption of power? Atlantis is gone, but is it? It is a story, and stories are not lost. They return, they evolve, they are told again, taking new shapes, serving new masters. And what is Atlantis, if not the perfect story? A city that never was, and yet in some way always is. A warning wrapped in myth, a vision of power that could never last. The sea rises, the city gleams, the empire stretches its hand, and then silence. A city ruled by kings, bound by laws, blessed by the gods. A city that believed itself eternal. Atlantis was not merely powerful, it was structured, disciplined, ordered. Its people lived under a code, a harmony set in place by Poseidon himself. 10 kings ruled, each descended from the god, bound to each other by sacred oaths. Every 5 and 6 years, they gathered in the great temple at the island's heart, surrounded by the gleaming silver walls, the golden statues of their ancestors watching. There they sacrificed a bull, letting its blood mix with the earth before they swore their allegiance anew. They did not break their word. They did not seek more than they were given. Not yet. At first, Atlantis thrived. It was a land rich beyond imagination, a city whose very foundations shone with precious metals, whose waters ran warm with the gifts of nature, whose ships carried its influence far beyond its shores. They were builders, traders, warriors, philosophers. Their palaces reached toward the sky, their harbours welcomed the world. They knew no poverty, no hunger, no fear of foreign invasion. Theirs was a civilization so complete, so balanced, that it could stand for eternity. But eternity is a fragile thing. The gods gave Atlantis its power, but the gods also watched, and power, even divinely granted, is never static. The city changed. The kings, once wise and just, grew ambitious. The sacred oaths, once spoken with reverence, became ritual, habit, obligation. The empire that had been content with its wealth turned outward, seeking more. Its ships crossed the seas not just to trade, but to conquer. Its warriors no longer defended, but attacked. The Atlanteans, once a people of balance, had shifted. They believed their strength was proof of their right to rule. They believed they could take what they wished. This was the moment of departure, the turning point. What had been a civilization of harmony became a civilization of excess. And in excess, there is always a reckoning. What did the gods see? What did they decide? Plato does not give us their judgment outright, but he leaves us the answer in the silence that follows. Atlantis had reached its peak, and in reaching it had ensured its own fall. The sea was patient, the earth was still, but the end had already begun. The Atlanteans did not know they had sealed their fate. Not at first. They believed they were expanding, not overreaching, that they were claiming what was rightfully theirs, not destroying the balance that had sustained them. Their fleets, once symbols of trade and connection, became instruments of conquest. Their warriors, once guardians, became invaders. They moved against Egypt, against Libya, against the lands of the Achaeans, and finally they set their eyes on Athens. Athens, the city of virtue, the city of balance, the city that, in Plato's telling, stood in direct contrast to Atlantis. Where the Atlanteans had become arrogant, the Athenians remained humble. Where Atlantis grew decadent, Athens remained disciplined. The Athenians did not seek empire. They did not lust after dominion. They were strong because they were just. And so when Atlantis came to subjugate them, Athens stood alone, small, outmatched, yet unshaken. It should not have been a contest. The Atlanteans had wealth, numbers, divine lineage. They had power beyond reckoning. The Athenians had only their virtue. And yet, in Plato's telling, that was enough. The army of Atlantis fell. The invasion failed. The conquerors were turned back by those who had nothing but their principles, their courage, their discipline. This is the moral pivot of the story. Atlantis is not just an empire that collapses, it is an empire that is defeated. Its fall is not merely a natural disaster or a divine punishment, but a philosophical reckoning. The Athenians do not triumph because they are stronger, they triumph because they are righteous. This is the world as Plato constructs it, where justice, not brute force, is the final arbiter of fate. But what of Atlantis itself? If the gods had merely wished to punish them for their hubris, why allow them to fall to Athens at all? Why not destroy them outright? Perhaps this is part of the lesson. Power unchecked may rise, but it will always meet a force greater than itself, not necessarily in strength, but in righteousness. A city ruled by greed will eventually face a city ruled by virtue. And when that moment comes, it is not the gold, nor the ships, nor the armies that will decide the outcome. It is something deeper. Atlantis had tested itself against the world and lost. But its true reckoning had yet to come. Its fate was not to be conquered, but to vanish. The gods had been watching, the sea had been waiting, and then the earth began to shake. The trembling began deep beneath the city, a soundless shift in the earth's foundation. At first it was nothing, a murmur beneath the streets, a whisper through the columns of the great temples. But then the whisper grew. The walls groaned, the statues trembled, the harbours so long filled with ships of war and wealth heaved as the water beneath them twisted and swelled. The Atlanteans looked to the sky, but the gods did not answer. They looked to the sea, and it had already begun to rise. There was no enemy at the gates, no fleet upon the horizon, no blade drawn against them. Their fall was not at the hands of men. It was something greater, something ancient, something patient. The balance they had disturbed had turned against them. The cracks spread quickly. The ground split open, swallowing streets, markets, palaces. The fires of their forges, once the heart of their industry, burst upward, igniting the sky with smoke and embers. The waters surged inland, devouring what the earth did not take. And then, as if guided by unseen hands, the great city began to sink. Not all at once. Slowly, piece by piece, Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves. Its towers crumbled into the deep, its golden statues, its silver-clad temples, its harbours, its streets, all consumed. The ocean claimed everything, leaving only foam and silence where an empire had stood. Plato does not linger on the destruction. He does not tell us of the screams, the prayers, the desperate grasping for something solid as the world collapsed around them. He does not tell us of those who tried to flee, nor of those who stood still, waiting, accepting, knowing that there was nowhere left to run. He gives us only the result. Atlantis was no more. A single night, he says. That is all it took. One night to erase an empire. And yet, what is truly lost? The city, yes. The wealth, the power, the armies. All gone. But the story remains. It moves through time, adapting, shifting, changing. Atlantis is not buried beneath the sea. It is buried in our minds, resurfacing when we speak of power, of ambition, of the price of excess. It does not die. It waits. The waves return to stillness. The world forgets. But in the depths, Atlantis lingers unseen. The sea is calm, but it remembers. Atlantis was gone, but its absence was louder than its presence had ever been. The world above continued, indifferent, unknowing. The tides washed over the ruins, smoothing them, erasing the last remnants of what had been. There would be no ruins to excavate, no artifacts to uncover. The sea had swallowed it whole, leaving no trace but the story itself. And so the question lingers. If a city vanishes without a witness, without a single stone remaining, was it ever real? This is the paradox Plato leaves us with. Atlantis exists, but only in words. It is a city built in speech, constructed in the mind, its foundation not stone but myth. Critias speaks of it as history, yet everything about it bends towards something else. A parable, a caution, a fiction that feels like truth. It is not just the story of a lost city, it is the story of power unchecked, of civilizations that believe themselves invincible, of the inevitable weight of time pressing down upon all that rises too high. But there is another question. One that Plato does not ask outright, but one that lingers at the edges of his text. Did Atlantis deserve to fall? If Atlantis had been as monstrous as its final moments suggest, if it had become a city of conquest, corruption and arrogance, then its destruction seems almost righteous. The gods did not destroy a paradise, they corrected an imbalance. Justice, not vengeance, shaped its fate. But Plato gives us another image, a quieter one. He tells us that Atlantis was once great, that it was once noble, that it did not begin in greed, but in balance. And so we are left with something more tragic. Not a city that fell because it was always doomed, but a city that doomed itself. A people who were given everything, who had harmony and wisdom and abundance, and who lost it, not in a moment, not in a single act of arrogance, but in a slow, imperceptible drift away from what they once were. This is why Atlantis haunts us. It is not the story of some distant, imagined land. It is the story of every civilization that ever believed itself untouchable. It is the rise of empire, the temptation of expansion, the blindness to the warnings that were always there. And so, as the waters cover the last traces of the city, the real question is not whether Atlantis existed. It is whether we are already living in it. Plato does not tell us to search for Atlantis. He does not invite us to find its ruins, to dredge its streets from the ocean floor. He does not say that it can be uncovered, only that it can be remembered, that it should be remembered. And yet we search. For centuries, the idea of Atlantis has pulled explorers across the seas, scholars through archives, archaeologists into the depths. They have traced its outline in the shifting sands of the Sahara, in the lost cities of the Mediterranean, in the volcanic remnants of Santorini, in the drowned ruins off the coasts of Cuba and Japan. They have mapped it onto every place that once stood mighty and now lies silent. But every search ends the same way, with nothing. No temples, no golden statues, no proof. This is where Plato's game reveals itself. Atlantis is not a mystery to be solved, it is a lesson to be understood. A riddle whose answer is not in geography, but in philosophy. A city that does not exist, but whose fall happens over and over again. Because Atlantis was never just one place. It was every place that had ever risen beyond its means. It was Athens in its imperial overreach. It was Rome in its decadence. It was the British Empire at its height, stretching itself thin, unaware of its decline. It was every civilization that believed its power could outrun its flaws. Every kingdom that mistook wealth for wisdom. Every empire that failed to see the weight of history pressing down upon it. And yet we continue to seek it. Not just in the depths of the ocean, but in ourselves. Because to understand Atlantis is to understand the fragile nature of power, the ease with which greatness becomes arrogance, the quiet turning of fate before the fall. Perhaps that is why Plato left the story unfinished. He did not need to describe the aftermath. He did not need to show us what came next. We are already living in the aftermath. Atlantis does not need to be found, it needs to be remembered. The sea rises, the land crumbles, the waves smooth over what once was, and still we tell the story. Atlantis did not disappear, it was transformed, not in the physical sense, no stones remained, no ruins for future generations to stumble upon, but in something deeper, something more enduring. It became an idea, a warning, a reflection cast upon the surface of history. What was lost to the waves was reborn in words, in speculation, in longing. A city that no longer existed and yet refused to fade. It would return in the Renaissance as scholars pored over Plato's texts, tracing its outlines onto the maps of the New World. It would be invoked by utopians who saw in its grandeur a lost perfection, and by imperialists who imagined it as an undiscovered jewel waiting to be claimed. It would be twisted by mystics into a vision of a forgotten golden age, by pseudoscientists into a foundation for myths of supremacy and hidden knowledge. Atlantis became whatever the world needed it to be. A paradise lost, a prophecy of doom, a fable of excess, a secret history buried beneath the sea. And yet, in every version, the core remains the same. Atlantis rises, reaches too far and falls. The pattern does not change. The lesson is always there. That is why Atlantis lingers. Not because we believe in the city itself, but because we recognize its shape in the world around us. In nations that stretch beyond their limits, in leaders who mistake power for permanence, in societies that forget that no empire, no matter how great, is immune to time. We want to believe that we are different, that we have learned, that we are wiser than those who came before. But Plato's story endures because history does not break free from its cycles so easily. Every age tells itself that it is not Atlantis. Every empire looks at the ruins of the past and insists that it will not share their fate until the ground trembles, until the waters rise, until once again the silence comes. We do not need to look for Atlantis. We need only to look around. Plato's Atlantis was a story, but it was never just a story. It was an argument, a challenge, a mirror held up to the world. It was not meant to be taken literally, yet it has outlived entire civilizations that once dismissed it as fiction. Why? Because Atlantis is a story that never stops being true. It is the temptation of power, the slow drift from virtue to excess, the belief that greatness is eternal. It is the moment when confidence becomes arrogance, when wisdom is replaced by indulgence, when expansion becomes unsustainable. It is the realization, always too late, that the foundation beneath our feet is not as solid as we thought. Plato did not need to describe the people of Atlantis in their final moments. He did not need to show them running through the streets, grasping for the collapsing pillars of their golden temples, reaching out for the ships that would never carry them to safety. He knew that every civilization would recognize itself in their place. He knew that those who understood would see the warning before the water rose. And yet, we tell ourselves that Atlantis was unique, that it was an anomaly, an ancient mistake that we are wise enough to avoid. We search for its ruins as if to prove that it was real, as if to place it safely in the past, separate from our own time. But Atlantis is not the past. It is the present, and it is the future. It is the empire that cannot imagine its own decline. It is the civilization that believes itself exempt from history. It is the power that assumes its rule is unshakable, its foundations unbreakable, its reach limitless. And it is the silence that follows. We do not need to wonder what happened to Atlantis. We already know it happens over and over again. The only question is whether, when the time comes, we will see the water rising before it is too late. The waves return to stillness. The land that once held a great empire is silent. The world moves forward, forgetting. But Atlantis remains, not beneath the sea, not in the ruins we search for, but in the stories we tell, in the warnings we fail to heed, in the cycle we continue to repeat. It is not the city that matters, it is the idea. Plato knew this. He did not craft a history. He crafted a myth with purpose, a legend designed to outlive the civilization that conceived it. And it has. It has survived the rise and fall of kingdoms, the shifting of borders, the rewriting of history. It has been reborn in every era, in every empire that believed itself eternal. It is invoked when power reaches too far, when ambition turns to hubris, when the tides begin to shift. Atlantis is the story of every civilization that believed itself beyond destruction. It is the fate of Rome, of Byzantium, of the dynasties that crumbled, of the nations that forgot their own limits. It is the fear beneath the surface of every empire that stands today, the unspoken question whispered at the edges of power: how long before the waters rise? It is not a prophecy, not a curse. It is a pattern, a warning, a truth that does not change, no matter how many times we convince ourselves that it does not apply to us. Atlantis is gone, but it was always going to be. That is the point. That is why it endures. And that is why, long after our own towers fall, long after the names of our cities are worn away by time, long after new civilizations rise to take their place, the story of Atlantis will still be told. The tide is always moving, the earth is always waiting, the silence always comes, but the story remains. The waves return to stillness. The land where Atlantis had once stood was gone, swallowed without a trace. No ruins, no wreckage, nothing left for future generations to find. The world moved on, forgetting, as it always does. But Atlantis was not truly lost. It remained, not beneath the sea, but in the mind. Plato did not intend for it to be found. He gave no map, no coordinates, only a story, a warning wrapped in myth, a lesson disguised as legend. Atlantis was never meant to be a place but a mirror, one that reflects the rise and fall of all civilizations that dare to see themselves in it. It was not history but prophecy, not an anomaly, but a pattern that repeats itself across time. Every empire believes itself beyond the reach of fate. Every civilization tells itself it has learned from the mistakes of the past. They build their cities taller, their fleets stronger, their wealth beyond measure. They convince themselves that power is permanence, that they are not like the ones who came before. And then the tide shifts, the cracks appear, the weight of their own ambition begins to pull them down. Rome was not Atlantis, yet it followed its path. Byzantium was not Atlantis, yet it too fell. Great dynasties, mighty nations, golden ages that seemed untouchable, none lasted. They expanded, they flourished, they believed in their own endurance. And then one day, they were gone, their monuments left to crumble, their names fading into dust. Atlantis is not about what was lost. It is about what is always being lost. It is not a story of the past, but of the present, of the future. It lingers not because we wonder where it was, but because deep down we recognize it, in the cities we build, in the ambitions we chase, in the warnings we ignore. Plato left the story unfinished, but he did not need to complete it. The ending was never in his hands. It was in ours. The lesson of Atlantis does not lie beneath the waves. It waits in the choices we make, in the balance we maintain or disrupt, in the belief that we are immune to history. The sea is quiet now. The world above continues. But the tide is always moving. The earth is always waiting. Atlantis is gone, but it does not need to exist to be real. The city had vanished, but its name endured. Long after the waves had erased its streets, long after its towers had crumbled into the deep, Atlantis lived on in the stories men told, not as ruins to be uncovered, not as artifacts waiting in the dark, but as a spectre, a whisper, an echo of something both lost and inevitable. Plato had crafted more than a legend, he had created a test. To hear the story of Atlantis was to ask a question, to wonder whether its fall was unique or if it was only the first of many. He described a civilization that had everything, wealth beyond measure, power beyond limit, knowledge beyond its time. A civilization that should have lasted forever, and yet it did not. That was the lesson. That was the truth buried beneath the waves. For centuries, men have searched for Atlantis, tracing its outline onto islands and lost continents, seeking proof that it was real. But to find Atlantis would be to miss the point entirely. It was never a single place. It was every place that rose too high, that reached too far, that mistook its fortune for destiny. What was Atlantis but a name for the cycle that repeats itself across history? The great cities that fall, the empires that stretch beyond their means, the rulers who cannot see the ground crumbling beneath them. Atlantis is not an island beneath the sea. It is the shadow that lingers over every civilization that believes itself eternal. The story does not end with its destruction. That is why it still haunts us. It is not a closed chapter, not a tale with a beginning and a definite end. It is a pattern, a rhythm, a warning that goes unheard until it is too late. The same arrogance, the same blindness, the same silence before the fall. Atlantis is gone, but its fate is not unique. The sea does not choose its victims. The waves do not remember one name over another. They wait, they rise, and when the moment comes, they return. The cities of today stand firm, their towers gleam, their rulers speak of progress, of power, of permanence, but the tide is always moving. The earth does not forget. The story of Atlantis is not over. It was never over. It only waits to be told again. No civilization believes it will be the next Atlantis. That fate belongs to others, those who came before, those who made mistakes, those who failed to see the signs. But history does not ask who believes in it. It simply unfolds. The story of Atlantis endures not because it was lost, but because it was inevitable. Plato did not write about a distant past. He wrote about an eternal present. The pattern repeats. Great cities rise, great powers flourish, and in their triumph, they sow the seeds of their own undoing. Not in a single moment, not in one act of hubris, but in the slow, almost imperceptible drift from wisdom to excess, from restraint to indulgence, from balance to collapse. We tell ourselves that knowledge will save us, that history is a guide, that we are wiser than those who came before. We build walls against the sea, markets against decline, institutions against ruin. And for a time, they hold. But the tide does not recede simply because we command it to. The warnings are always there. The question is whether we see them in time. Plato left Atlantis unfinished because he did not need to complete it. The conclusion was already written, waiting in the rise and fall of every civilization that would come after. We do not need to ask what happened to Atlantis. We only need to ask whether, when the sea rises again, we will recognize our own reflection in the waves. The last traces of the city have long since faded. The world above it has changed, forgotten, moved forward. But the pattern remains. The tide moves in cycles. The earth shifts beneath us, and the silence that follows is always the same. Atlantis is gone, but the waters are patient, and history is waiting. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform